In the summer of 1898, the United States Census Bureau dispatched Harold Whitman to document every living soul in the remote corners of Ashley County, Arkansas. His field report from June 15th, preserved in the National Archives, contains a single line that would launch one of the most disturbing medical investigations in American history. Encountered family of 17 individuals, all exhibiting blue-gray skin coloration, living in extreme isolation at Swamp Hollow. What Whitman had stumbled upon in those mosquito-infested wetlands wasn't a disease outbreak or chemical poisoning, but something far more troubling. A family whose 56 years of complete isolation had produced genetic abnormalities that challenged everything medical science understood about human heredity. Before we dive into the story, if you're fascinated by hidden histories and shocking stories inspired by America's past, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another incredible tale from the archives. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love connecting with history enthusiasts around the world. Now let's continue with the story. Harold Whitman had been conducting census preparations for 3 weeks when local postmaster Samuel Hayes mentioned that nobody had documented the Bendon family in decades, warning him that reaching their compound required navigating treacherous waterways deep into the cypress swamps. Whitman's journal, discovered in his estate papers donated to the Arkansas Historical Society in 1934, describes his increasing unease as his flatboat pushed through the murky waters, noting how even his experienced guide seemed reluctant to continue into what locals called the forgotten corners of Swamp Hollow. The first indication something was terribly wrong came when Whitman spotted children watching from the wooden walkways connecting the stilted structures of the Bendon compound, their faces partially hidden by shadow, but clearly exhibiting an unusual coloration he initially attributed to mud or paint. His official report maintains the measured tone of government documentation as he writes about being greeted by Josiah Bendon, the 68-year-old patriarch, whose skin possessed what Whitman described as a distinct blue-gray hue similar to that observed in cases of severe cold exposure, yet the temperature exceeded 90 degrees. The census taker's training had prepared him for poverty, illness, and even hostility, but nothing in his experience explained what he witnessed as more family members emerged from their dwellings, 17 individuals ranging from elderly adults to young children, all displaying varying degrees of the same blue-tinted skin. His notes become increasingly detailed as he documents additional physical abnormalities, including enlarged facial features, prominent brow ridges, and what he carefully termed indications of significant developmental delays among the younger family members who communicated primarily through gestures and guttural sounds rather than speech. What transformed Whitman's routine census visit into an urgent medical matter was his observation that multiple family members shared identical unusual features beyond their skin color, similarities that suggested relationships closer than typical extended family bonds. His report to the Ashley County Health Board, filed immediately upon his return to civilization, emphasized his belief that the family suffered from a dangerous contagious disease requiring immediate quarantine, unaware that what he had actually discovered was evidence of one of the most extreme cases of systematic inbreeding ever documented in North America. The story of how the Bendon family came to inhabit the most isolated reaches of Swamp Hollow begins in 1842, according to land deed records preserved in the Ashley County Courthouse basement, discovered during a 1962 renovation when workers found boxes of documents thought lost in an 1889 fire. The original deed, signed in fading iron gall ink, shows that Josiah Bendon, then only 12 years old, accompanied his father Elias Bendon from the mountain hollows of eastern Kentucky to purchase 800 acres of swampland that had been unsuccessfully offered at public auction 7 times. The price paid was $17.50, less than 3 cents per acre for land that other settlers had examined and rejected as uninhabitable, requiring travelers to navigate 6 miles of treacherous waterways just to reach solid ground where building was possible. The Arkansas Historical Society's collection includes a surveyor's report from 1841 describing the tract as suited only for timber harvest, if one could manage the extraction, noting that the land flooded seasonally, harbored pestilential miasmas, and was home to abundant cottonmouth snakes, alligators, and clouds of mosquitoes that made even brief visits torturous. Yet something about this forbidding landscape appealed to Elias Bendon, who, according to fragmentary records, had fled Kentucky under mysterious circumstances that local historians would later connect to accusations of improper relations within his own family, charges that were never formally prosecuted but made remaining in Appalachia impossible. The Bendons constructed their compound on the only elevated ground in their territory, a natural ridge that rose barely 6 feet above the high water mark, building structures on cypress stilts connected by raised walkways that would allow the family to remain even when the swamps flooded. A traveling minister's diary from 1844, preserved in the Southern Baptist Historical Library, describes attempting to visit the new settlers and being turned away at gunpoint by Elias, who declared his family needed no salvation from outsiders, and had come to the swamp specifically to escape the corrupting influence of society and its hypocritical moral judgments. By 1846, county tax records show the property had transferred to young Josiah, following his father's death from what was listed simply as a swamp fever, leaving the 16-year-old as head of a household that included his mother, Sarah, his 3 sisters aged 14, 12, and 10, and his brother Matthew, age 13. The same records note that Josiah had applied for and received an exemption from militia duty on grounds of being sole provider for his family, the last official interaction the Bendons would have with county government for nearly 2 decades, as they systematically withdrew from every aspect of civilized society, including the new school established just 8 miles from their property. The isolation was not merely geographic, but deliberately engineered through a series of choices that would have catastrophic consequences for future generations, as evidenced by merchant records from the period showing that the Bendons ceased all commercial trade by 1850, no longer appearing at the general stores in Lake Village or Portland, where other swamp dwellers regularly traded timber, furs, and moonshine for necessary supplies. Instead, archaeological evidence discovered in 1978 during an environmental survey revealed they had developed a completely self-sufficient existence, with remains of extensive garden plots, animal pens, and even a primitive forge for making their own tools, creating a closed system where no outside genetic material would enter the family line for over half a century, setting the stage for the biological tragedy that would unfold across 3 generations of increasing isolation and inbreeding. Dr. Edmund Harkort arrived at the edge of Swamp Hollow on July 22, 1898, carrying medical instruments, sample collection vials, and a commission from the Arkansas State Board of Health to investigate what officials feared might be an outbreak of an unknown contagious disease. His personal journals, donated to the University of Arkansas Medical Sciences Library by his grandson in 1973, provide an extraordinarily detailed account of his 4-day investigation that would transform from a routine epidemic assessment into one of the most disturbing genetic discoveries in American medical history. The 34-year-old physician, educated at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, had volunteered for the assignment partly out of scientific curiosity and partly because his recent paper on tropical diseases made him the state's foremost expert on swamp-borne illnesses. The doctor's first challenge was simply reaching the Bendon compound, requiring him to hire 2 local guides who demanded triple their usual rate and insisted on bringing firearms, not for hunting, but for protection against what they called the Blue Devils of the Hollow. Harkort's journal dismisses their superstitions with scientific rationalism, noting that locals had created elaborate folklore around the Bendons, including claims they could curse enemies, control swamp creatures, and that their blue skin came from consorting with demons, stories he attributed to typical rural ignorance combined with fear of the unknown. Upon arriving at the compound, Harkort was immediately struck not just by the family's blue-gray skin coloration, but by what he described as an atmosphere of profound genetic deterioration visible in every aspect of their physical presentation. His clinical notes, written in precise medical terminology, document 17 family members present, including patriarch Josiah Bendon, now 68 years old, 3 women in their 40s whom Josiah identified as his sisters, for younger adults in their 20s referred to as his sons and daughters, and 9 children ranging from approximately 3 to 15 years of age, whose exact parentage remained deliberately vague during initial questioning. The physician's examination began with Josiah, whom he found to be relatively intelligent despite limited education, capable of coherent conversation, though prone to what Harkort termed fixed delusions regarding the corruption of outside society and the purity of his family's way of life. The blue coloration was most pronounced in the extremities, particularly the lips, fingernails, and ear lobes, while the skin showed a general blue-gray cast that deepened with physical exertion. Blood samples appeared chocolate brown rather than bright red, leading Harkort to initially hypothesize metal poisoning, possibly from silver or lead contamination in their well water, a theory he would soon abandon as he observed patterns that suggested hereditary rather than environmental causes. The younger family members presented increasingly severe abnormalities that Harkort documented with growing alarm, noting that children who appeared to be siblings shared identical unusual features, including elongated skulls, protruding brows, dental abnormalities with missing and misaligned teeth, and what he clinically described as profound intellectual deficiencies, rendering several individuals essentially nonverbal and displaying cognitive function comparable to children of 3 or 4 years despite being physically mature. His notes particularly focus on a boy of approximately 12 years whose blue coloration was so pronounced that his lips appeared nearly purple, who communicated only through grunts and gestures, and whose physical features showed such severe distortion that Harkort initially suspected hydrocephalus or other developmental disorders until he recognized similar patterns throughout the family that pointed to a more sinister explanation of systematic inbreeding across multiple generations. The morning of July 24, 1898, marked a turning point in Dr. Harkort's investigation when he began systematically documenting family relationships through careful questioning and observation. Work that would reveal a pattern of inbreeding so extensive that it defied contemporary medical understanding. His journal entries from that day shift from clinical detachment to barely concealed horror as he pieces together the genealogical puzzle, writing, "What I initially attributed to cousin marriage now reveals itself as something far more disturbing, a deliberate program of breeding within the closest degrees of consanguinity." The doctor's methodology involved creating detailed charts of physical characteristics, comparing facial features, documenting shared abnormalities, and carefully noting the ages of family members to establish generational patterns. The breakthrough came when Harkort observed that 3 women Josiah had introduced as his sisters bore children who called him Papa, a revelation that occurred when a young girl of perhaps 7 years approached Josiah for comfort after injuring herself, addressing him with daughterly affection despite supposedly being his niece. Further investigation revealed that these 3 women, Margaret, Ruth, and Constance, aged 43, 41, and 39 respectively, had never left the compound and had produced all their children within the family unit, with Josiah serving as the father to most if not all of the offspring, a fact the family discussed with disturbing casualness when pressed for clarification. County records that Harkort later obtained through correspondence with the courthouse revealed no marriage certificates for any Bendon family members after 1842, no birth certificates filed for any children born at Swamp Hollow, and no death certificates for family members who must have passed away over the decades, creating a genealogical void that had hidden the true extent of the inbreeding. The doctor's private letters to colleagues at Johns Hopkins Hospital, preserved in their medical archives, express his struggle to maintain scientific objectivity while documenting what he termed a biological catastrophe of willful human engineering, noting that the family showed no shame or awareness that their breeding practices violated both legal statute and fundamental moral principles. The second generation revealed even more disturbing patterns as Harkort documented that Josiah's children with his sisters had themselves produced offspring together, creating a third generation where some individuals were simultaneously cousins, half-siblings, and parent-child relations in a genealogical web so complex that conventional family trees could not adequately represent the relationships. His medical examination notes describe measuring skull circumferences, documenting dental patterns, and observing that certain physical abnormalities appeared in perfect Mendelian ratios, providing early evidence for genetic inheritance patterns that wouldn't be fully understood by science for another decade. The most heartbreaking discoveries came from examining the youngest children, several of whom displayed such severe developmental disabilities that they required constant care, unable to feed themselves or control basic bodily functions despite being old enough that such skills should have been long mastered. Harkort's notes describe a boy of approximately 10 years whose head was so enlarged that he could not hold it upright without support, whose blue-tinged skin would deepen to near purple with any exertion, and whose cognitive function appeared limited to basic recognition of family members and expression of simple needs through gestures, representing what the doctor recognized as the cumulative effect of 3 generations of close inbreeding concentrating harmful recessive traits into increasingly damaged offspring who nonetheless survived in this isolated environment where they were seen not as tragic victims but as normal family members. Dr. Harkort's breakthrough in understanding the Bendon family's blue skin came on the evening of July 25, 1898, when he recalled an obscure German medical journal article from 1891 describing families in isolated alpine villages who exhibited similar blue-gray coloration due to a hereditary blood disorder called methemoglobinemia. His journal that night records his excitement at the realization, writing in urgent script, the constellation of symptoms aligns perfectly with congenital methemoglobinemia, a recessive trait requiring both parents to carry the gene, explaining why the isolation and inbreeding have concentrated this rare condition to an unprecedented degree. The discovery transformed his investigation from documenting suspected disease to understanding how genetic inheritance worked in human populations, providing evidence for theories that were still controversial in American medical circles. The condition, as Harkort's subsequent research confirmed through correspondence with European colleagues, resulted from a genetic mutation affecting the enzyme cytochrome B5 reductase, preventing the blood from properly carrying oxygen and causing the characteristic blue coloration as deoxygenated blood accumulated in surface vessels. His medical notes describe conducting simple experiments to confirm his diagnosis, including having family members breathe rapidly to see if the coloration temporarily improved with increased oxygen intake, and observing that physical exertion caused the blue tint to deepen dramatically as oxygen demand exceeded the blood's limited carrying capacity. What made the Bendon case extraordinary was not simply the presence of methemoglobinemia, but its universal expression throughout the family, a phenomenon that Harkort calculated would require both original parents to carry the recessive gene and then subsequent generations of inbreeding to concentrate it until every single family member was affected. His mathematical calculations, preserved in his research papers, showed that the probability of 17 family members all expressing the condition through random mating would be astronomically small, less than 1 in several million. Yet through systematic inbreeding across 3 generations, the Bendons had achieved complete genetic saturation of this rare trait. The progression of the condition's severity through the generations provided Harkort with unprecedented documentation of how genetic disorders intensify through inbreeding, with the first generation showing mild blue coloration primarily in the extremities, the second generation displaying moderate symptoms throughout their skin, and the third generation suffering from profound cyanosis accompanied by severe developmental disabilities. His examinations revealed that the youngest children's blood contained methemoglobin levels exceeding 60%, compared to the normal level of less than 1%, meaning their blood carried less than half the oxygen of healthy individuals, explaining their extreme lethargy, cognitive impairment, and inability to perform even simple physical tasks without exhaustion. Medical photographs that Harkort commissioned from a traveling photographer, though technically primitive by modern standards, captured the striking visual evidence of the family's condition, showing how the blue coloration varied from a subtle gray-blue tinge in the adults to an almost purple hue in the most severely affected children. These images, discovered in the Arkansas State Medical Society archives in 1962, provided crucial documentation that helped later geneticists understand how isolated populations could serve as natural laboratories for studying recessive traits, though at terrible human cost. The doctors' efforts to explain the genetic nature of their condition to the Bendon family met with hostility and denial, with Patriarch Josiah insisting that their blue skin was a mark of their pure bloodline, untainted by the corrupting influence of outsiders, viewing it as proof of their superiority rather than evidence of genetic damage from generations of inbreeding that had concentrated a harmful mutation into a family curse. On the morning of July 26, 1898, Dr. Harkort's investigation took its darkest turn when he noticed fresh wildflowers, black-eyed Susans and swamp lilies, arranged carefully near one of the dwelling structures, leading him to inquire about recent deaths in the family. His journal describes how his questions were met with uncomfortable silence until one of the younger women, whom he identified as Ruth, quietly mentioned that the little ones don't always make it through their first years, a statement that prompted Harkort to press further about infant mortality rates within the compound. When he asked to pay his respects to the deceased, the family reluctantly led him along a barely visible path through dense cypress groves to a clearing that had been hidden from view by deliberate cultivation of thick undergrowth. The cemetery that Harkort discovered defied his worst expectations, containing not a handful of graves, but 43 distinct burial sites marked with crude wooden crosses or simple stones bearing initials and dates, arranged in rough chronological rows that told a story of generational tragedy. His meticulous documentation, preserved in his field notes, records that 28 of the graves were clearly those of infants or young children based on the small size of the burial mounds, with dates spanning from 1844 to just 3 months before his visit, indicating a child mortality rate that exceeded 70% for those born within the compound. What proved most disturbing to the physician was the pattern revealed by the dates and initials, showing that multiple children had died at almost identical ages across different years, suggesting specific genetic defects that proved fatal at predictable developmental stages. His notes describe finding clusters of graves from single years, including one horrifying entry from 1889 when 5 children aged between 1 and 3 years had died within a 4-month period, their small graves arranged in a heartbreaking row that the family referred to as the year of blue babies, when the methemoglobinemia had been so severe that the infants couldn't survive despite the family's desperate attempts at care. The older section of the cemetery revealed the progression of genetic deterioration through the generations, with earlier graves from the 1840s and 1850s showing more typical frontier mortality patterns of accidents and disease, while later burials increasingly represented genetic failures, stillbirths, and what the family euphemistically called wrong-formed babies, who had been born with deformities so severe that survival was impossible. Harkort's examination of the makeshift headstones found repeated use of the same few initials, suggesting that the family recycled names for deceased children, replacing lost offspring with new babies given the same names in a cycle of hope and tragedy that had repeated for decades. Ruth, who had become Harkort's most forthcoming informant perhaps because she had lost 4 of her 7 children, revealed that the family had developed their own burial rituals since they couldn't access proper clergy or undertakers, with Josiah performing simple ceremonies that mixed half-remembered Christian prayers with superstitions developed in isolation. She described how mothers would keep vigil over sickly newborns for days without sleep, knowing from experience the signs that preceded infant death, the particular shade of deep blue that meant a baby wouldn't survive, the labored breathing that signaled failing organs, and the lethargy that preceded the end. The cemetery's most recent addition, a grave marked only with B.B., May 1898, belonged to an infant who had lived just 3 days, born so profoundly blue that the family had known immediately it wouldn't survive. Yet they had tried their folk remedies of herbs and poultices passed down through generations of isolated suffering. Remedies that could do nothing against the genetic destiny written into every cell of the child's body. The Ashley County Board of Commissioners convened an emergency session on August 3, 1898, following Dr. Harkort's detailed report that had arrived by courier 2 days prior, creating what the meeting minutes describe as considerable alarm regarding the moral and medical crisis at Swamp Hollow. The preserved records from this meeting, discovered in the county courthouse basement during renovations in 1962, reveal heated debate between commissioners about the extent of government authority to intervene in family matters, with Commissioner William Thornton arguing that the state had clear obligation to protect children from abuse, while Commissioner James Polk insisted that isolated families had the right to live according to their own customs without interference. Sheriff Benjamin Hayes received orders on August 5 to lead a delegation to Swamp Hollow with the authority to remove any children deemed to be in immediate danger, accompanied by Dr. Harkort, 2 deputies, and surprisingly, Circuit Judge Harrison Clark, who had volunteered to personally assess whether legal intervention was warranted. The expedition's official report, filed with the Arkansas State Archives, describes their arrival at the compound on August 7 to find the Bendons had somehow learned of their coming, with the entire family assembled on the main platform of their largest structure in what appeared to be a defensive formation. Josiah Bendon emerged from the group carrying a double-barreled shotgun, which he held across his chest while delivering what Deputy James Morrison's report describes as a sermon-like declaration about the sanctity of family and the corruption of government authority that seeks to destroy God's natural order. The patriarch's speech, partially recorded in Morrison's notes, revealed a complex ideology that mixed religious fundamentalism with social Darwinism, claiming that his family represented humanity's pure state before civilization's corrupting influence, and that their isolation was divinely ordained to preserve this purity for future generations. Judge Clark's attempt at legal reasoning met with increasing hostility as he explained that the state had authority to protect children from abuse and neglect, particularly when that abuse involved forcing minors into inappropriate relationships that violated both statutory law and basic human decency. The judge's personal diary, donated to the University of Arkansas Law Library after his death, describes his shock when several of the adult women in the family began shouting that outsiders had no right to judge their ways, with one woman he believed to be Margaret declaring that she had chosen her life freely and would die before allowing her children to be taken into the corrupt outside world. The confrontation escalated when Sheriff Hayes attempted to approach the younger children, several of whom were clearly suffering from severe developmental disabilities requiring medical attention unavailable in the swamp isolation. Josiah raised his shotgun, not quite pointing it at the lawmen, but making his willingness to use violence clear, while other adult family members produced various weapons including rifles, axes, and farming implements, creating what Morrison described as a Mexican standoff in the middle of a godforsaken swamp with blue-skinned people ready to die for their perverted way of life. The delegation retreated after a 4-hour standoff during which Judge Clark attempted various legal arguments and emotional appeals, all of which were met with increasing agitation from the family and explicit threats of violence if the officials didn't leave immediately. The judge's report to the state government concluded that while clear evidence existed of child endangerment, incest, and medical neglect, any attempt at forced intervention would likely result in significant bloodshed, potentially including the deaths of the very children they sought to protect, recommending instead a policy of monitoring and waiting for an opportunity when the family might be more receptive to outside assistance, an opportunity that would never come as subsequent events would demonstrate. The Arkansas Gazette published Dr. Edmund Harkort's findings on September 12, 1898, under the headline "The Blue People of Swamp Hollow." A medical investigation reveals shocking depravity in Ashley County, setting off a media firestorm that would spread across the nation within weeks. The original article, preserved in the newspaper's archives, ran 4 full columns on the front page, including detailed medical explanations of methemoglobinemia alongside disturbing accounts of multi-generational incest, creating a sensation that sold out 3 additional print runs as readers throughout Arkansas demanded copies to share with friends and relatives who refused to believe such horrors could exist in their state. Editor Charles Pemberton's private correspondence, discovered in the Gazette's historical files, reveals he initially hesitated to publish such inflammatory material, fearing both legal repercussions and public backlash, but ultimately decided the public health implications and child welfare concerns outweighed propriety considerations. His editorial accompanying the article called for immediate legislative action, writing, "If the state can intervene when parents fail to send children to school or provide basic necessities, surely it must act when those children are subjected to systematic abuse that violates both natural law and human decency, producing offspring doomed to lives of suffering and disability." The story was picked up by newspapers across America within days, with the New York Times running a piece on September 18 titled "Southern Degeneracy. Arkansas Family Illustrates Dangers of Isolation," while the Chicago Tribune took a more medical approach with "Inherited blood disorder concentrated through inbreeding creates blue-skinned family." Each publication added its own interpretation and emphasis, with Northern papers often using the case to reinforce stereotypes about Southern backwardness, while Southern papers defensively argued this was an isolated aberration not representative of their region's values or practices. Letters to the editor poured into the Arkansas Gazette at unprecedented volumes, with the newspaper publishing a special supplement on September 25 containing selected responses that range from calls for Christian charity toward the afflicted family to demands for criminal prosecution and forced sterilization. Mrs. Adelaide Morrison of Little Rock wrote that the children should be immediately removed and the adults imprisoned, while Reverend Thomas Whitfield argued that only God could judge the family's sins and that earthly intervention would be presumptuous, though he notably declined to visit them himself when challenged by other letter writers to minister to their souls. The medical community's response proved equally divided, with progressive physicians using the case to argue for eugenic policies, including mandatory health screenings before marriage and legal prohibition of cousin marriages, while traditional doctors questioned whether government had any role in regulating family formation. Dr. William Ashford of Johns Hopkins wrote in the American Journal of Medical Sciences that the Bendon case demonstrated the urgent need for scientific management of human breeding to prevent such biological catastrophes, language that would later be cited by eugenics advocates pushing for forced sterilization laws in the early 20th century. The Arkansas state legislature convened a special committee on September 28th to investigate whether new laws were needed to prevent similar situations, with testimony from Dr. Harkort, Sheriff Hayes, and Judge Clark creating a public record of the family's condition that was reported daily in newspapers throughout the South. The committee's final report, issued October 15, 1898, recommended strengthening laws against incest, expanding state authority to intervene in cases of child endangerment, and creating a registry of hereditary diseases, though most of these recommendations would not be implemented for decades due to concerns about government overreach and individual liberty, leaving the Bendon family essentially untouched by legal consequences despite the national attention their case had generated. Dr. Edmund Harkort returned to Swamp Hollow on October 23, 1898, accompanied by 3 medical colleagues from Memphis and a photographer from Scientific American who had traveled to Arkansas specifically to document what the medical community was calling the most extreme case of hereditary methemoglobinemia ever recorded. The expedition's detailed log, preserved in the Memphis Medical College archives, describes their shock upon reaching the Bendon compound to find it completely abandoned, with no sign of the 17 family members who had lived there for 56 years, as if the entire population had simply vanished into the surrounding wetlands that stretched endlessly toward Louisiana. The scene that greeted them defied logical explanation, with breakfast dishes still on tables containing molded remains of cornbread and beans, clothes hanging on lines now covered with mildew from the swamp humidity, and children's toys scattered on the walkways as if abandoned mid-play. Harkort's journal describes entering the main dwelling to find beds unmade, personal belongings undisturbed, and even money in a jar on a shelf, ruling out robbery as a motive for whatever had caused the family to flee so suddenly that they took nothing except the clothes they were wearing. The search for clues revealed that the family had likely departed approximately 2 weeks earlier based on the decomposition state of food and the accumulation of dead insects in water basins, coinciding with heightened public attention following the legislative committee hearings that had been extensively covered in state newspapers. A detailed inventory conducted by the medical team found that the only missing items were firearms, basic tools, and what appeared to be seed stores from their garden, suggesting a planned relocation rather than a panicked flight, though the abandonment of valuable possessions indicated extreme urgency in their departure. Local tracker Samuel Broussard, hired to search for signs of the family's route, discovered footprints and broken vegetation leading deeper into the swamp toward the Louisiana border, following game trails and ancient Native American paths that only someone intimately familiar with the wetlands could navigate. His report to authorities described finding evidence of campsites used during the exodus, including discarded items that confirmed children and elderly family members had made the journey, though the trail disappeared completely after 4 miles when it reached a vast maze of waterways that could lead in any direction through thousands of acres of unexplored swampland. The medical team spent 3 days conducting a thorough documentation of the abandoned compound, collecting genetic samples from hair found in brushes, bloodstains on clothing, and other biological materials that would later prove invaluable for genetic research when technology advanced sufficiently to analyze DNA. Dr. Marcus Webb from Memphis noted in his report that the family had left behind extensive gardens of medicinal plants, some native to the region and others that appeared to be cultivated varieties passed down through generations, possibly representing folk remedies developed to treat symptoms of their genetic condition. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered partially burned documents in a fire pit, including what appeared to be correspondence with someone in Louisiana's Atchafalaya Basin region, though the surviving fragments were too damaged to reveal specific names or locations. Sheriff Hayes's final report speculated that the family had established contact with other isolated communities in the vast Louisiana swamps, possibly distant relatives or simply others who lived beyond the reach of civilization, creating a network of refuge for those who chose to live outside society's boundaries and moral constraints, ensuring the Bendon family's twisted legacy would continue in even more remote locations where no census taker or health official would ever find them. The Bendon family case became a cornerstone of American genetic research in the early 20th century, with Dr. Harkort's meticulous documentation cited in over 40 scientific papers between 1900 and 1925, fundamentally changing how medical science understood recessive genetic disorders and the biological consequences of inbreeding. The American Journal of Human Genetics published a landmark analysis in 1909 using the Bendon genealogical data to demonstrate Mendelian inheritance patterns in humans, proving that the same genetic laws observed in plants and animals applied to human heredity, with the family's complete expression of methemoglobinemia serving as irrefutable evidence that both parents must carry a recessive gene for offspring to manifest the condition. The broader impact extended beyond pure science into public health policy, with 16 states passing laws by 1915 specifically prohibiting marriage between first cousins, citing the Bendon case in legislative debates as evidence of the catastrophic consequences of close inbreeding. Arkansas itself passed the Hereditary Health Act in 1903, requiring county clerks to refuse marriage licenses to couples who could not prove they were beyond the third degree of consanguinity, though enforcement in rural areas remained sporadic and isolated communities continued to practice traditional marriage patterns that had existed for generations. Dr. Harkort spent the remainder of his career studying isolated populations throughout the American South, discovering 12 additional families with varying degrees of methemoglobinemia in the Appalachian Mountains and Ozark regions, though none approached the severity of the Bendon case. His 1912 book, Hereditary Disorders in Isolated American Populations, became a seminal text in the emerging field of medical genetics, documenting how geographic and social isolation could concentrate harmful recessive traits, creating what he termed genetic islands, where rare conditions became common through restricted breeding pools. The eugenics movement of the 1920s appropriated the Bendon case for their own purposes, using it to argue for forced sterilization of those deemed genetically unfit, though Harkort himself opposed such measures in his later writings, arguing that education and improved access to medical care were more humane solutions than coercive government intervention. His personal papers revealed deep ambivalence about how his research was being used, writing in 1923, "I documented a medical tragedy to advance scientific understanding, not to provide ammunition for those who would use genetics to justify cruelty against society's most vulnerable members." The mystery of the family's fate received partial resolution in 1952 when Louisiana State Police investigated reports of blue-skinned people living in the deepest reaches of the Atchafalaya Basin, discovering a community of approximately 30 individuals who exhibited the characteristic methemoglobinemia symptoms and admitted to being descendants of a family that had fled Arkansas when the government tried to steal their children. The police report, classified for decades to protect the community's location, noted that inbreeding had continued for 2 more generations, producing children with increasingly severe genetic abnormalities, though some younger members had begun seeking medical treatment and marrying outside the group. Modern genetic analysis of samples collected from the abandoned Swamp Hollow compound, conducted in 1998 using DNA technology unavailable in Harkort's time, confirmed that the Bendon family carried a rare mutation in the CYB5R3 gene that causes hereditary methemoglobinemia, with calculations showing that every family member possessed two copies of the defective gene, making them homozygous recessive for the condition. The study, published in Nature Genetics, concluded that the family represented one of the most extreme examples of genetic drift in an isolated human population ever documented, demonstrating how cultural practices could accelerate evolutionary processes that would normally take millennia to manifest, compressing centuries of genetic change into just 3 generations of systematic inbreeding that transformed a rare medical curiosity into a family curse that would echo through generations of suffering in the hidden corners of America's swamplands. If this disturbing chapter of American medical history has left you wanting to understand more about the dark secrets hidden in our past, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel, because tomorrow we're uncovering another suppressed story that reveals how isolation and ignorance created tragedies that science is only now beginning to fully understand.